Hi, I'm Tim. Join me in this video as we talk about the FAA's Remote ID program history and next steps. Let's get to it. Perhaps no subject in the history of radio control model airplane flight has caused as much angst, emotion, consternation as the concept of the FAA's Remote ID program that'll start on September 16th, 2023. In this video, I'd like to go over some of the history of remote ID, why the FAA is pursuing it, what's driving it, and some likely next steps to include the future of remote ID after it starts on September 16th of 2023, and how the FAA is going to deal with people, modelers, and remote ID. Just for your information, this is being filmed August 1st of 2023. The mission statement of the FAA is to produce the world's safest, most efficient aerospace system. The FAA takes this charge very seriously, and the FAA has been working for several years to figure out how to handle the influx of drones, both commercial drone operators and hobbyists, flying in the national airspace system to continue their mission of safe and efficient flight operations. It's important to understand that the commercial drone industry in the US and around the world is a large industry and growing fast. Estimates are that in 2023, the commercial drone industry will be about $29 billion. These range from air taxis to farm operations, real estate, disaster response, package delivery. Even insurance companies are finding out the importance of drone operations. Added to this mix of commercial drone operators are the hobbyists. Industry estimates are as high as 7 million hobby drones are flying in a mix with this in the national airspace system with all of this activity. And what the FAA is trying to do is to figure out how to handle this commercial drone activity, hobby drone activity, along with the normal manned aircraft operations going on. So clearly, with this amount of activity going on, the FAA is going to be closely involved for plans to integrate all these aircraft as they fly and operate in the national airspace system. An important concept to understand as we discuss drones flying in the national airspace system is the FAA's concept of see and avoid. So see and avoid is a policy that the FAA has used for decades, where with manned aircraft, the pilots in each aircraft can see and avoid other aircraft to try to prevent a collision, missed instructions, any number of situations. The see and avoid policy allows for surprisingly diverse operations at quite busy airports around the world. I was a flight instructor for 3 years, for example, at Honolulu International Airport. We would fly primary students in Cessna 150s and 152s and 172 aircraft out of Honolulu International, VFR, Visual Flight Rule flights, combined with instrument flight rule airliners, Boeing 747s coming in from international destinations. We all worked and flew together at that airport due to training, but also we could see and avoid the other aircraft. That was kind of a foundational principle for safety to allow these types of actions to occur. The problem the FAA faces with unmanned aircraft systems, I may talk about UAS and drones interchangeably, is these unmanned aircraft cannot apply the see and avoid principle. Right now with technology, there's no way for a drone to see and avoid another aircraft. There may be someday, but that's not here right now. So the goal of the commercial operators, remember that $29 billion industry in 2023, is fully integrated operations in the national airspace system. Without a pilot on board, the only way these integrated flight operations are going to happen is through technology, most of which does not even exist today. The FAA's policy or approach towards drones, unmanned aircraft systems, they have pretty clear strategies on what to do. It will change and evolve over time, but the thesis has been to start with the easy stuff first before going to the harder stuff. So easy stuff is drone registration, Part 107, some initial training for drone pilots flying in the national airspace system. Later on will be the ultimate goal of fully integrated air operations. And early on, the FAA and the partners who were talking about this challenge realized there just had to be some method to identify these unmanned aircraft, these drones flying along in the national airspace system. ATC is air traffic control. To control the aircraft, you have to know it's out there. And so the idea of some sort of remote identification of these drones came into being as something that was going to have to be addressed and dealt with at some point to get drones working in a fully integrated sense with the other manned aircraft. Recreational RC pilots, whether it's me flying fixed wings, helicopters, or drones, we were part of these discussions whether we realized it or not. Remote ID became a real thing in the 2018 FAA Authorization Act. This was a 5-year act that funded the FAA really up through 2023. And in the act was congressional language directing the FAA to do something, to come up with an actual plan for remote ID of unmanned aircraft systems. So what happens in government? Congress passes a law, the FAA Reauthorization Act, in this case of 2018. There's very clear direction from Congress. It'll go to a cabinet level agency, in this case the Department of Transportation, DOT. FAA falls under the Department of Transportation. So what'll happen is people at the FAA, lawyers, people at the FAA will read the act and respond to Congress saying, okay, we read the act, this is what you think you want us to do, to get any feedback, to make sure that Department of Transportation, the FAA, and Congress are all in lockstep on whatever they're going to do. It could be stronger cockpit doors, it could be pilot training, it could be crew rest, or in this case, remote ID for unmanned aircraft. So to make sure I get the words right, I'm going to read from the actual report of DOT, the Department of Transportation, to Congress on their interpretation of the act reauthorizing the FAA and with remote ID. So the DOT reported that to further the overall objective of integrating UAS operations into the national airspace system, Congress recognized the importance of remote identification. Furthermore, the Act laid the foundation for the FAA's work with operators and security partners to realize the importance of remote identification and to reach agreement on how to address it. The DOT continues in their report to Congress, and this is a quote from the report, quote, remote identification is fundamental to both safety and security of UAS operations. Remote identification will be necessary for routine beyond visual line of sight operations, operations over people, package deliveries, operations over congested areas, and the continued safe operation of all aircraft in shared airspace. Now this is a boldface item, it's not, but pay attention to this. DOT continues. With remote identification, the FAA and our national security and public safety partners will be better able to identify a drone and its operator, assess if that drone is being operated in a clueless, careless, or criminal manner, and take appropriate action if necessary. Remote identification is the FAA's highest priority UAS-related rulemaking effort. So this is incredibly direct language for a senior government agency. And it's important to understand that the idea of remote ID is regarded as foundational for the commercial unmanned aircraft operations. It could be FedEx, air taxi, anybody that wants commercial drone operations fully integrated, you've got to start with a remote ID concept. So these people are happy as can be that remote ID is coming into place. On the other hand, hobbyists, RC pilots view the entire idea of remote ID as possibly unconstitutional, illegal, and an egregious overreach by a government agency like the FAA into individual affairs. So what do you do with these two very different competing lines of thought to the concept of remote ID? So a quick addendum to what I said before, what DOT said about remote ID, that was back in 2018. That was literally over 4 years ago. The idea that remote ID is going to go away is just not going to happen. It might have different terms, different iterations, different variations, technology, but the concept of tracking drones is just not going to go away. So as you deal with your thoughts about the FAA, the government, what the government is or is not doing, it is useful to go back to the FAA's mission statement to create the safest and most efficient aerospace system in the world. So is the FAA doing this job? A good way to look at it, perhaps a benchmark, is commercial airline operations and crashes. So how many commercial airline crashes have there been in the recent past? Now recall to allow for a safe operating environment, the FAA uses a variety of means, regulations, training, professional operators, and equipment to try to reach this goal of having a safe operation. So just for numbers, the U.S. operates every day about 25,000 flights carrying 2.5 million passengers from over 80 countries. That's an awful lot of people, airplanes, traffic going on. The last crash of a commercial airliner in the United States was in 2009 with a tragic Colgan Air crash in New York. 49 people were killed in that crash, one on the ground as a result of fatality. There has not been an airplane crash since the 2009 Colgan Air crash. So this is being filmed in 2023, 14 years without an aircraft crash. To me, that's a pretty good safety record, and it is a result of a lot of hard work by the people in the FAA, pilots, mechanics, flight attendants, controllers, to all make that happen. Now with the remote ID, drone operators, hobbyists like myself, are being brought into the discussion because we're operating along with these professionals in the National Airspace System. We discussed the 2018 Authorization Act that gave the FAA marching orders to do something about remote ID. The way the FAA does this is they have a notice of proposed rulemaking. This is a regulation that we think we're going to issue. It is a draft. It is sent out for review and comment. The initial FAA remote ID regulation was a complete horror show for hobbyist drone operators. For example, it wanted you to log on to a national network to track your drone flights. You would have to pay for this service anywhere from $3 to $10 a month. Just a lot of things because the FAA just didn't know much, if anything, about drone operations. These draft rules are sent out for review and comment. There was discussion with industry stakeholders to include the Academy of Model Aeronautics and various general aviation organizations. It received over 53,000 comments on it. There was a complete overhaul of the regulation to have the final ruling, which was adopted in late December of 2020 and will become in effect on September 16th of 2023. The changes are significant. It allowed things like FRIAs, the FAA Recognized Identification Area, responsibilities for drone manufacturers, and remote ID modules. There are many videos to include on my channel what remote ID is. Essentially, it is a broadcast system while the drone is flying that gives certain information on the drone, altitude, heading, airspeed, and the takeoff location as best as it can determine that. There are 3 general areas of remote ID. It can be standard remote ID, where it's built in by the drone manufacturer in the factory. You can have a remote ID module that you attach to your home-built airplane or drone that doesn't have remote ID. And then there are FRIAs, or FAA Recognized Identification Areas. These are areas accepted by the FAA, typically AMA clubs, where you can fly in a defined airspace where your club normally flies below 400 feet AGL. You do not need any remote ID equipment at all to operate in a FRIA. So where are we with this whole remote ID thing? Now remember, the remote ID ruling comes into effect on September 16th, 2023. This is August 1st, 2023. Nobody has to do anything to comply with the remote ID until September 16th. So with the standard remote ID, where the drone manufacturers install remote ID in the factory, this is in pretty good shape. There are listed on the FAA website. There's well over 100 drone models and manufacturers that are compliant with remote ID. The manufacturers had to be compliant by December 22nd, 2022. This was a very important thing for the manufacturers because the Commerce Department could literally ban sales in the US if they did not comply. So the standard remote ID is in pretty good shape. Anybody buying a drone today will be remote ID compliant. The remote ID module is in a very bad state. There are modules out there, they're $200 or so. That is far too much money, weight, and size for the regular operator. I have not seen an affordable plug-and-play remote ID module yet. FRIAs are in pretty good status. The FAA started approving FRIAs in mid-July. I know our club field in Georgia, we have our FRIA when we need it on September 16th. I expect to see more and more FRIAs approved as we get closer to the September 16th date. Will the implementation date of remote ID on September 16th be moved or delayed? I think there's a pretty good chance that could happen. I think what may be the driver is a lack of availability either on cost or supplies of the remote ID modules. I don't know. It's just a guess on my part, and we won't know that until pretty much the last minute when the FAA is going to make a decision on that. We'll just have to wait and see. Remote ID is a regulation, and the fact that recreational radio control model airplane pilots are now being subjected to an FAA regulation. This is a jolt to a lot of RC pilots, drone operators, many of whom who may not even know that the FAA existed. So there's a lot of angst on this. Can they do this? Can they force me to follow these rules and so forth? And this really is fairly new because the closest RC pilots came to FAA oversight was a 1981 advisory circular. Let me get the title right. It was a circular on model aircraft operating standards, which was essentially the AMA safety code. I'm serious. Now, as to be expected, and it's the way the system works, the remote ID ruling has already been challenged in federal court as unconstitutional. So let me make sure I get the right court. It was challenged by a group of drone pilots out of Florida. The challenge was based on privacy concerns with the drones knowing the takeoff location and citizens coming to where that drone's taking off and maybe assaulting the pilots or whatever. And the case was brought to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit in July 2022. The plaintiffs lost the case. The three-judge panel ruled that, quote, the limited local real-time information sharing required by the remote ID rule is a far cry from continuous surveillance, and that drone pilots generally lack any reasonable expectation of privacy in the location of their drone systems during flight in the national airspace system. So information on what happens next with remote ID is anybody's guess, because it's going to be in the future. I firmly believe, based on the language and the necessary technology to grow commercial unmanned operations in a fully integrated manner in the national airspace system, you're going to have remote ID or some variant concept of remote ID to build upon for that to happen. I think as the initial remote ID systems are rolled out, this is a huge change. They've not been tested in any adequate method at all. I think some things will work, some things won't work, but the idea will still be there to build upon better remote ID systems. I also think there's a natural outgrowth to allow controllers to have some idea of what drone traffic is doing. Somehow, some way, someday, technology will take these fairly small remote ID systems, aggregate the data so you'll have a better picture that perhaps air traffic control can use for safety to segregate or alert manned aircraft to drone activities. A lot of viewers think FRIAs are a temporary thing that'll go away. I don't share that view. The original proposal by the FAA was for FRIAs to just be 1 year as they transitioned to a whole remote ID concept. That was changed in the final ruling. The FRIAs are good for 4 years. We'll see if they are renewed, but 4 years is a long way away. And just to show you how the approach is evolving right now, per the law, a community-based organization like the AMA, you have to make the request to the FAA through the community-based organization. The Academy of Model Aeronautics is working an approach saying, hey, look, we've used FRIAs for a while. Mr. FAA, why don't you let us handle the FRIA approval? We'll let you know what's going on, and that way it can just be a more streamlined system. So there will be changes, I think, on how and where FRIAs are approved, but right now they're good for 4 years, and I think they make sense because they can accommodate large numbers of aviators, people that are lucky enough to be near a club. It doesn't cost any money because you don't have to buy any equipment, and the FRIAs are essentially a form of restricted airspace for modelers, very small restricted airspace that has essentially zero impact for commercial controlled aircraft due to low altitudes and can segregate and let the FAA know where hobbyist operations are. The remote ID modules, they've got to come up with a lower priced one. And keep in mind the drone manufacturers are installing and will continue to install remote ID in their system as they're sold. If you accept drones last around 3 years or so before they age out, within 3 years, essentially 100% of store-bought drones will be remote ID compliant, whether the operators know them or not. And I think the drones are the huge focus of the FAA for safety and security as these hobby drones operate in the national airspace system. I'd like to offer now some closing thoughts and observation on the FAA, how they enforce the regulations, and can the FAA make you spend money to fly your drone or RC model aircraft? So the FAA writes regulations and they expect compliance with the regulations for safe national airspace system aircraft operations. The way the FAA works is the FAA spends a great deal of attention on commercial operations because they don't want passengers who are buying a ticket or taking a ride in a Cessna to have something to worry about that there's not some level of attention to make sure that there's their safety. When you have purely recreational operations, the FAA takes a much lighter touch. If you own a Cessna or an airline or whatever, the FAA is constantly inspecting those aircraft, studying crashes, testing materials, and it's very common if you have an aircraft, you get a notice called an airworthiness directive where you have to do something that could cost you a fair amount of money to keep your aircraft airworthy. It could be replacing a spar and a wing, it could be propellers that are bad. It is quite common to have to spend money to comply with an airworthiness directive. The other thing the FAA does, as the amount of traffic increases, they can't force you to spend money on avionics, but they can certainly restrict your areas that you can fly and how you operate your aircraft if you choose not to do that. Perhaps a perfect example from the early days of flights is the fact of having an electrical system and a radio in an airplane. Notice up until about 1930 or so, it was fairly unusual to see electrical systems in airplanes, radios for sure. Fields were uncontrolled. You would just find the field, look out for other traffic, and land, looking out for other traffic and hope everything worked out. As airports got more busy, good example is Logan Airport in Boston, Massachusetts. Logan Airport opened in 1923 as an Army airfield, short runways, dirt. As it advanced to commercial operations in the mid-1930s, they put in a control tower. So now you have got to talk to a tower to land and take off at Logan Airport. If you say, I'm not going to put a radio in my airplane, that's fine. The FAA did not force that, but you're unable to do any sort of routine operations at Logan Airport or any other control field due to a lack of a radio. So a few words on FAA enforcement. I don't know how the FAA is going to enforce remote ID. I don't know, but I can make some guesses or some observations about how the FAA runs enforcement for other sections of manned aircraft. Again, the FAA takes a very serious view of commercial operations versus recreational, or for manned aircraft, what is generally called general aviation. So when I was flying commercially, it'd be very common, you're going out for a flight that date, and all of a sudden in the jump seat, there's an FAA inspector. He just pops in 5 minutes before we're pushing back, hi, I'm the FAA, and he's going to evaluate us on that flight. It could be a company check airman doing that. This happened routinely all the time, in addition to ramp checks at any time. So let's take a look at general aviation. If you own your own Cessna 172, there are some things per the Part 91 regulations that you have to comply with to be a legal pilot. You have to have a current medical. You have to have a current biennial flight review signed off by an instructor. If you're carrying passengers, you have to have 3 takeoffs and landings within 90 days. Further restrictions for night flight, for tail dragger operations, and so forth. There is no way the FAA knows whether or not you have logged your 3 landings in 90 days, or you have a medical, or a biennial flight review, or anything. The only way the FAA can do that is what they call a ramp check. And a ramp check is a legal thing. An FAA inspector just shows up and says, hi, I'm from the FAA, this is a ramp check. It could be the FAA inspector decides to do that. He could have an anonymous report by somebody that says you need to check on this person. He could have seen an unsafe situation like you landed on a taxiway. He or she can do a ramp check. Once they do a ramp check, you are going to have to demonstrate that you have a medical, that you have your license, that you have a photo ID, that you have landing currency, that you have a biennial flight review, that you have a airworthiness certificate, registration, and so forth for your aircraft. There's no getting around that. So it's a fairly light touch. I just don't have any friends or heard of anybody flying general aviation that has a ramp check, but it could happen. So for the drones, RC models, if you're at an AMA club field with a FRIA, I don't see the FAA showing up ever. I don't think the FAA is going to be too concerned about commercial drones because they know over a time period of a few years, they're just going to come out with a remote ID installed. So that's kind of taking care of itself. For somebody flying over their ranch in Montana with a remote ID module, I think there's going to be a very low chance of an FAA inspector coming up and saying, show me the remote ID module. Perhaps at a contest or a sanctioned event, but the FAA just does not have the manpower to do these extensive checks of RC recreational modeling activities, in my opinion. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Our remote ID is coming soon. It's just about 7 weeks away from the filming of this video. It'll be interesting to see how the FRIAs come out, if it's delayed, and how hobbyists adapt to the remote ID ruling. I have said, and I'll continue to say, remote ID is here to stay. It's foundational for the successful integration of unmanned aircraft into the National Airspace System, and it'll be some interesting days ahead as the technology is developed and matures. Thank you very much.